good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Alexander Matheou, who's the Asia Pacific Regional Director for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Welcome to the show, Alexander. It's good of you to join me here. So we've spoken to a few of the IFRC representatives on the show or here on the station, but for those at home who may not be familiar specifically with the work that the IFRC does within this region, maybe you can set the scene for us. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do here and maybe your role specifically.
Thank you for having me. Well, it's an old organization but with a very modern purpose. Okay. We were founded about 100 years ago, just after the First World War, when the world was ravaged by conflict and a giant pandemic, which was killing more people than even the conflict had.
So was that a couple of years ago, or was that 100 years ago?
Well, exactly. The purpose stays contemporary. But the idea was that conflict is rooted in a breakdown of communication, and that most crises don't stop at borders. So in order to create a culture of peace, and in order to address humanitarian challenges, you need to work together. And the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies was founded with the idea that at least the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies around the world, there's 191 of them now, who are auxiliaries to their public authorities, should meet together, support each other, try to create a culture of peace, and work to solve the humanitarian crises of the day. 100 years later, here we are still doing it. In Asia Pacific, our job is to try to ensure that in every country in Asia Pacific, there is a Red Cross or a Red Crescent Society that can be the first community-based responder to any disaster, natural or man-made, and that they work together and support each other if countries are not able to cope independently with their own crises.
That strikes a chord with me. The fact that it's been 100 years and we're still dealing with very contemporary issues of conflict and disasters. And you're right, without borders, they know no boundaries. How do you think, just based on your work and the observations being in the field, has the nature of crises evolved? Has the impact of humanitarian crises become deeper, more prolonged, worsened? What do you think? What are your observations?
Well, crises tend to affect more people nowadays than, for example, 100 years ago, because there are more people than there were 100 years ago. So the numbers of people that tend to be affected by droughts, cyclones, floods, conflict, tend to be higher. But if we look at how well are we doing responding to them compared to the past, well, if we take the example of 2017, nearly 800,000 people crossing the border from Myanmar to Bangladesh, if that had happened 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, many of them would have lost their lives when they crossed that border because of lack of access to medical care, shelter, because of maybe community violence. In fact, what happened, because the government of Bangladesh welcomed them and because the local humanitarian organizations and the international community mobilized, they provided water, shelter, food and protection for what was essentially a new city within a matter of weeks. I was there at the beginning. It was very traumatic to see it. Going back a couple of years later, you could see a relatively well-organized camp city.
Cox's Bazar?
Cox's Bazar. It's getting a bit worse now, and we can perhaps talk about that later, but that's a sign that something has got better about how we respond to crises. But if you ask me what is worrying me about our ability to cope with crises at the moment, it's partly that we have many going on at the same time. Big dramatic crises in Gaza, Ukraine, in Sudan, now in Syria, but we could go on. There are over 120 conflicts in the world and many more climate-related disasters. Two, they're going on for a long time. So, it might hit the news only for a few weeks, but the crises may go on for decades. So responding to the crisis in Afghanistan in August 2021, there was a surge of support. Everyone was interested. 2 years later, nobody was interested. Everyone will be interested in Syria this week. In 2 years' time, nobody will be interested in Syria, but the crisis will still be going on. So the length of crises is very problematic. Third issue is that we are not really sharing the burden for the responses at the moment. Even if you take Cox's Bazar, you'd have thought that the countries who would be most interested in ensuring that the camps were safe and dignified and that people were not desperate to leave, You would think that the countries first in line to ensure that would be Indonesia, India, Malaysia.
Neighbours, yeah.
Neighbours. But in fact, it's still mostly funded by a small group of European and North American donors. So there's something about world power has shifted, economic wealth has shifted, but the financial responsibility to ensure there is a global humanitarian system protecting people in crises, wherever those crises happen, that is still not a burden that's being fairly shared. So that's something I hope we can work on in the years to come.
So let's take the example of Afghanistan. You're absolutely, I mean, decades of conflict, and now the country has a change of leadership, is trying to rebuild, but is in international isolation because of the Taliban's curbs on civil liberties, particularly for women and girls. How does a humanitarian organization like the IFRC operate in that scenario?
Well, the first thing we need to operate anywhere is permission. We can't simply turn up and say we want to open a hospital or we want to deliver humanitarian assistance. So we have to work with whoever is in charge of a country or a part of a country in order to ensure we have access and safe access to operate. So the first thing we had to do after August 2021 was to meet the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, the Taliban leadership, and to underline what we do, that we're neutral, impartial, we have to be independent, to urge them to support their Afghan Red Crescent Society and to allow us to continue to operate. We also had to persuade the donors who were financing us to continue to do so and not be too afraid to do so because they didn't want to be associated with the ruling authorities in the country. So that element of diplomacy was critical at that moment to enable us to operate what is one of the largest health systems in the country and the largest relief operations in the country. Fortunately, they were agreeable to us continuing to work, which is why we are still able to do so.
Talk to me about that, the difficulties, the complexities in trying to persuade the international community not to abandon the most vulnerable populations in Afghanistan because of sanctions and ideology. How did you, as a humanitarian organization, navigate those complexities?
Well, our diplomacy works on multiple fronts. So yes, we do have to work with the donor countries about their willingness to politically take risks and support us in context.
It's a political risk.
For them, it's a political risk, which we understand. The optics can be difficult. You can get a negative headline. This is taxpayers' money. So if a leadership in a country is extremely unpopular in one part of the world, and there's a newspaper headline in that part of the world saying, do you realize your taxpayers' money is going here? It can absolutely backfire on a government. So it takes a lot of risk for them to say, yes, we'll try to support you anyway, even though there's a political risk for us to do so. But there's an element of diplomacy and persuasion to enable them or to encourage them to do that. But the other side of the diplomacy is working in the crisis country itself, which is to explain to authorities that may have a great deal of suspicion about international organizations, especially if they are funded from the parts of the world with whom they have had recent conflict, to allow us to operate. So you have to maintain diplomacy on all sides. Okay.
Well, maybe I should zoom out a little bit and ask you to explain how humanitarian diplomacy, what it is, first of all, what it entails, and how it works within an organization like yours, where neutrality is key. And when you think about humanitarian diplomacy, there's an element of advocacy that comes into play. How, maybe you can explain how that works for us.
Well, you can approach it differently. There are some organizations that do advocacy through public relations. So they will declare their concern about something that's happening in one part of the world. That is a legitimate form of advocacy that sensitizes the public to a particular crisis. It's not the one that we choose in the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, because we are very strict on the principle of neutrality, that we know that our primary responsibility is to the person in crisis. And our primary responsibility is to ensure we can reach that person when he or her needs us. And anything that we could say in public that would limit our ability to reach that person in crisis, we would avoid saying, which means we do our diplomacy in private. You know, what does it mean in practice? When I began my career, it largely meant speaking to my own government about how they were funding or choosing not to fund particular crises in the world. Nowadays, for me, it's more likely to involve meeting the leadership of the Taliban or generals in Myanmar to talk about why we should continue to operate in a principled and neutral way, and that why we need to reach this part of the country and what we will do there and why it's important, and that we will do so in a way that's not damaging for them and just in the interests of the people that we serve. In some ways, we can say we've got some success because we do operate, for example, all over Afghanistan. Less so in Myanmar, I'm afraid. We have less success there. But some of our advocacy clearly doesn't work, even behind closed doors. And the continued edicts we see on limiting the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan is an example of something we have raised again and again, but the edicts keep coming and they keep being more and more strict.
How operationally in Afghanistan, how would that work in providing medical and humanitarian aid to women and children? If there is this segregation of women and children, if you're not allowed to meet the patients themselves, how does the Afghanistan Red Crescent Society deal with that?
Well, the strength of the IFRC is that it is a network of national organizations. We don't fly these organizations in and out. They're there whether or not they are supported internationally. So the Afghan Red Crescent primarily is owned by Afghanistan itself and is mandated by the authorities in Afghanistan to operate. We don't have to impose that upon them. It's already there. What we would encourage is they respect its independence and they allow it to operate without interference. There are lots of restrictions on women and girls in Afghanistan, a lot. It's not entirely true to say that no services can be provided at all or that they cannot be employed at all. So we have 7,000 staff and volunteers, female staff and volunteers, employed by the Afghan Red Crescent who continue to provide critical health services to other women. So in some services, women can continue to work, volunteer, and provide services, but it's just much more limited than we would like.
Okay. If I could turn our attention to Myanmar, you said you've had not as much success in terms of humanitarian diplomacy there. Talk to me about that, not just engaging the military junta, which I understand controls some parts of Myanmar, but other parts are controlled by the resistance movement. Now, how is it talking to state actors, non-state actors, civil societies, those who control the borders? There are a lot of moving parts in Myanmar.
Well, in some ways, you've answered your own question. Because
that's a good point, yes.
Yeah, because in Afghanistan, you can deal with one authority and you can discuss the entire country. In Myanmar, you have to deal with multiple actors to discuss specific parts of the country. And if you deal with one, it may very well make it impossible for you to deal with another because you're perceived as having dealt with one. Now, our particular model of support, which is auxiliaries to the public authorities, means that we do work with the military in the capital of Myanmar. That's constitutionally and according to our statutes, that's who we have to work with. That can make the optics of our work difficult in other parts of Myanmar. I think on Myanmar, I would just say that there isn't a single organization, not one, that is capable to operate across the entire country. You have to make very difficult choices about where you think your strengths are. So there are some on the borders of Thailand who may be able to provide some support on the other side of that border. That may also be true of China and India. There are some who are located in the capital who may only be able to operate in parts of the country currently controlled by the military, or with limited amounts of permission to cross front lines and provide assistance in other parts. That makes it a very complicated environment in which to organize humanitarian assistance. And of the 17 or so million people who need assistance in Myanmar, you know, it's not a small percentage, but it's only around 30 or 40% of them who would get anything in a year. So it's not a successful environment for humanitarian action at all. We all hope that will change, but that is the difficult reality we face right now.
What needs to change so that it becomes incrementally more successful, if not infinitely better?
Well, whether we're talking about Syria or Ukraine or Afghanistan or Myanmar, there are no humanitarian solutions to these crises. There are only political solutions. So going back to your earlier question about why we engage in humanitarian diplomacy, partly it's our job to bear witness to people in crisis and try to link the most vulnerable with the most powerful, so the most powerful engage in supporting them. It's partly because international humanitarian law, humanitarian systems are foundations of peace in some ways because they create the conditions for stability and respect. But it's partly because it will only end in diplomacy. Any of these crises will only end in negotiation and diplomacy at some point, and the sooner the better. So the big answer to your question is the one thing that's needed is peace.
Peace, sure. With Myanmar, compare for me, in contrast, I mean, no two crises or situations are the same, but with Taliban, there is the element of international, with Afghanistan, there is an element of international isolation. What is it like with Myanmar in terms of international support by the international community?
I think if the possibilities to do more were there, if there was strong evidence that money can turn into humanitarian action to scale, if there was collaboration with humanitarian organizations to provide assistance, and if it was safe to do so, we would see a lot more support than we're seeing.
There's a hesitance at the moment?
But right now, I'm afraid, yes, those who want to provide support can see that the options are extremely limited to do anything with money. So even if you were to give 10 times more money to Myanmar, you may find that many actors couldn't actually do 10 times more than they're doing now, because they're doing as much as they're allowed to do. The funding is very low, so we could do more than we are doing, but there are limits to what any organization could do. So I think what they would need is hope that it was possible to have a positive impact and to engage constructively with stakeholders. In the absence of that hope, it's a huge deterrent to doing more. But as I say, ultimately, it needs a political solution. It needs neighbours primarily to engage in that solution.
Right. So on that note, Malaysia is a neighbour to, prolonged humanitarian crisis that's happening in our backyard. What can we do?
Well, we hope that the chairmanship of ASEAN next year by Malaysia will create an opportunity to convene, influence and advocate and to be a peacemaker here in Malaysia next year for Myanmar. Of course, it's not the first time a host for ASEAN has had that aspiration, so we have to be realistic. But I hope that's very much high on the agenda. Now, within the IFRC, another way of looking at your question, Malaysia does play an important role. It sits on the governing board of the IFRC. The representative for youth globally is a representative from Malaysia. The recent chair of the international conference, which brought together 191 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies and 196 states, all of whom are signatories to the Geneva Convention, was chaired by the chair lady of the Malaysia Red Crescent. So, we do see Malaysia in the IFRC space as an important humanitarian diplomat. Hopefully we'll see it in a broader space as well next year, chairing ASEAN.
Well, so we've been talking about crises that have been brought on by conflict, man-made conflict. What about the crises brought upon through the impact of the climate crisis? In this region where many countries are particularly climate vulnerable. How has the IFRC used its response to its humanitarian diplomacy, I might want to add, to drive action for climate resilience for these countries?
I would say we face two big threats in the world at the moment. One is escalating conflict, and two, looming behind that is this massive risk of climate disasters destabilizing everything about how we live and where we live. Just in our small world of the IFRC, we're seeing evidence of it because we are responding to approximately two new climate-related disasters every month at the moment. So we have something like 43 ongoing operations as we speak. So disasters that were relatively rare in the past, they were newsworthy, they would hit the headlines, they would generate global solidarity. They happen now at the blink of an eye in the headlines and disappear again, and nobody's even noticing because they're so frequent.
Is that 2 new crises?
Approximately, yeah.
Every month?
Yeah.
That's shocking.
So we're seeing something in Sri Lanka, something in, for example, this week in Malaysia, this month in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Bangladesh. It's seasonal and it's increasing in its frequency. And some of them are totally unexpected. They're happening in parts of the country or parts of the region where we typically were not seeing disasters in the past. Now, at some point, and that's bad enough as it is, because although it's dramatic in the short term, it's disastrous to livelihoods in the long term. Land cannot recover, or livelihoods cannot recover for a long time after such a disaster. But looming behind that are the even bigger threats, that if some cities run out of water, or if some coastal communities can no longer stay safely in those cities, or if islands are no longer habitable in the Pacific, these are huge changes to the way that we live and for people's lives and cultures. And and the permanency of their homes, and that's all on the horizon, I'm afraid.
So I'm assuming that this has been an ongoing trend that you're seeing, that there are so many new crises that the IFRC has to respond to. Looking ahead in the coming year, in 2025, how are you going to, what are you predicting, what are you seeing, what are you watching out for, and how will you manage and adapt to the sheer number of ongoing crises and new crises?
There's not one answer to that, because it's a combination of institutional building and capacity building. I mean, our particular strategy as the IFRC, as I mentioned before, is that every country has its independent capacity to respond through its Red Cross or Red Crescent Society. So that remains fundamental to us. That
there's a local
as
response.
Local as possible, and only as international as necessary. And actually, on that, we are seeing some promising news this year, because if you look at the floods in Vietnam, or the floods in Bangladesh, or the floods in Thailand, or the floods in the Philippines, a lot of the money to support the communities affected was raised domestically. And that's a shift that's very encouraging. The less the international community and the international organizations have to do, the more it means the more resilient communities are, and the more we can focus on the places where there isn't a capacity to cope, which is good. So I hope we'll see more of that. So that capacity building, the pre-positioning of stocks is critical. We need to get better at things like early warning, early action. If you look at the cyclones in Bangladesh 20 years ago, you may be aware that the mortality rates were horrific. But if you look at it now, a significant disaster results in relatively small numbers who lose their lives, because they've got better early warning.
Better systems.
They've invested in how to get to higher land quickly and to do so safely and to bring their livestock there or their livelihoods there. And that means that people are safer than they ever have been before, even though these disasters are more frequent. But the big threats about coastal communities or sinking islands in the Pacific, that is beyond our capacity as community-based responders. Again, that comes down to advocacy and politics and the investment necessary both to minimize the climate risk, but also mitigate the threat that comes from the inevitable disasters that will happen.
Just on the point of the more local the response, the better. What message would you like to leave with us tonight about our responsibility to help those who are in need?
Well, I mentioned there's two big threats looming over all of us, and they may seem like they're far away. It may seem that conflict is something that you see on the news, but is quite far from Malaysia. And thankfully, for the moment, it is. But there are enough hotspots around the world at the moment, and enough destabilizing of contexts and borders that we took for granted as being stable before, that you never know how it's going to unravel and when it will stop unraveling. And that is a risk to all of us. The second big risk is that we don't know how rapidly we're going to be affected by climate change. But there's certainly a lot of evidence at the moment that we are now living in the climate change era, that our climate has changed, that livelihoods that we took for granted we can no longer take for granted, places we thought we could live safely we are no longer sure we can live safely, amenities that we have absolutely taken for granted, like access to clean drinking water, may be something we can't take for granted in many parts of the world and many major cities within the next 5 to 10 years. Everybody needs to be aware of that, and what they talk about to their children, what decisions they make when they vote, what they do with their careers, how they choose to lead their businesses, if they're teachers, what they talk about at school. We need to be aware of what we are entering, the era we are entering, and be sensitive to it and try to play a positive role towards peace and towards a safer environment for our climate.
Can I ask you a personal question? You mentioned the word hope earlier. You've been in this field for a really long time. How do you keep that hope burning still?
Well, 2024 has not been a great year for hope, frankly, and perhaps more. I mean, I've been to many of the places where there's conflict at the moment. But I think what we witnessed in Palestine was amongst the most traumatic things any of us have seen in living memory, because a lot of people died and nobody was able to stop it. And that's something that we're all going to carry in our consciences, that we lived at this period when that happened. That's dashed many people's hopes and I think harmed their faith in the ability of the international community to do the right thing when it needs to act. Nevertheless, wherever I travel, even in the most difficult circumstances, there are always good people trying to do something to make their families, their communities safer. And while there is that balance between destructive forces and positive forces, you can always hope that the positive forces will win and encourage everybody to be on the right side of history and to be part of that positive force.
On that note, I have to thank you for being on the show. Thank you,
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.